So tonight's talk is going to focus on the role of neuropsychological testing in diagnosing language-based learning disabilities. As I said, I'm Nathan Doty. I'm a co-director of a neuropsychological practice in Concord, known as Achieve New England. And then I also am on the board for the Massachusetts dyslexia branch of the Dyslexia Association, and am the Northeast Regional representative on the branch council executive committee for IDA as well. And we've had a lot of folks express interest in tonight's webinar, just as we're getting into the fall part of the school year, really starting to think about the role of testing, both in school as part of initial or three-year reevaluations for students, but also I'm going to talk specifically about where more detailed assessment of a child's or adolescent's neuropsychological profile might be relevant. As I mentioned, so I'm a neuropsychologist at Achieve New England, and what we do is we focus on integrated evaluations for students. And so when students come to us, it's usually seeking a more comprehensive assessment that looks not only at sort of academic progress and intellectual ability, but also things like all aspects of thinking and learning that might be relevant for a student. So this can include attention, language skills, phonological processing, as we'll talk about, visual motor skills, and other areas that would be relevant for learning. We see students of all ages, 18 up to age 26, and we really try to use a strengths and weaknesses framework. So not just identifying areas where a student might be struggling, but also looking at areas where there are strengths that we want to build upon. And the goal is certainly to identify any relevant diagnoses that might inform our understanding of a student, whether it be learning disabilities, attention-related issues, or even social emotional concerns. But most importantly, to allow those to guide us in coming up with a framework and a roadmap for helping students. So it really sort of seeks to go above and beyond what would just be that, are they at, above, below, or at grade level, to really kind of understand the full child and come up with interventions that might be relevant for school, but also beyond school and supporting them. So I also first want to just talk a little bit about the history of neuropsychological assessment, because it's going to help us to understand why, when we have neuropsychological evaluations, and many of you may have seen them either across your desk as providers or have seen them as parents, there's quite a bit of variability in the approaches used to those. And one of the reasons for that is that the old model of neuropsychological assessment, where it sort of originally came about, was really looking at folks that had had some sort of injury in the brain, whether it be focal head injury or other kinds of brain-related concerns, to understand what regions of the brain might be impacted. So it sort of kind of bore out of departments of neurology, often in hospital-based settings. But really what's happened over time is that imaging, right? So MRI or EEG and things like that have helped us to better understand brain functions in a way that we don't really need neuropsychological assessment for that. But one thing that this form of evaluation does is that it really does a nice job of seeing where an individual's particular skills lie relative to others in their age group or in the normative group. And that helps us to really characterize strengths and weaknesses. So we've really moved toward a more integrative model of neuropsychological assessment, which is kind of designed to understand where an individual is functioning across domains, whether it be academically, social, emotional, independent living skills, things like that, to be able to understand the big picture of how they're doing and how they're functioning in day-to-day life, and then to use that to guide our diagnosis and understanding. Another piece that we're going to talk about that's an important role of assessment, both neuropsychological and educational assessment, is to be able to track over time an individual's progress, right? So that if we're intervening, we can learn about how effective those interventions are in supporting someone's progress. So the types of individuals that come to our office for evaluation, really it's a broad range. So sometimes we get folks that may be being referred for the first time. It's uncertain what kinds of learning challenges might be going on, but we're seeing that they're struggling in a particular area, or that a student is maybe struggling with the social emotional goals, and there's a need to better understand what might be underlying that. Sometimes it's students that maybe have been seen by a number of providers already. The problem problems have been previously identified, but there's a lack of clarity as to how the different pieces fit together of their profile, or even whether it's one thing or another that might be causing the problem. So listed here is just the kinds of questions that oftentimes parents or teachers or other providers will come in asking, so we have things ranging from, why is Jacob having such a behavior problem? What factors underlie school refusal? Why is Lena so lazy? And how can we help David's learning, right? So these are the kinds of questions that might be relevant for a more thorough evaluation. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the different domains of neuropsychological testing and what a neuropsychological assessment looks like. But I want to sort of weave into that an understanding of sort of a particular case. And so that'll help us to kind of think about it in a more real world way. So I'm just going to read, this is a case of Jeremiah, and mom came in, this is a 13-year-old 8th grader. Mom came in saying, I just don't know what's up with Jeremiah. He's a great kid, but he has struggled in school since the very beginning. He was slow to walk, slow to talk, slow to learn his letters and numbers. Frankly, he's always been a step behind. First and second grade were tough, but he had great teachers and we worked a lot with him at home, so he made it through. Since starting middle school, he's really floundered. His reading and spelling just aren't up to grade level, and math is an issue too. Homework time is the worst. It takes him twice as long to get things done. He never knows where to start, and he seems lost and scattered. His dad thinks that it's just laziness, but I'm not even sure what's going on. Maybe it's a learning issue, maybe motivation, maybe some combination of both. His teachers thought testing might be helpful, so that's why we're here. So, this is really a very common kind of situation that we might see where a parent comes in and is noticing difficulties, but not sure to where to begin with where the struggles are. And then also sort of seeing a component of, maybe there's a motivation piece, right? How do we kind of understand whether this is part of the student's profile, or is this something else going on, some contextual factor? So broadly speaking, what a neuropsychological evaluation should do is answer a number of key questions. So it should tell us where an individual's strengths and weaknesses are with regard to all of those areas of learning, and we're going to review those. It should also tell us what kind of progress is being made, and that may be progress toward grade level expectations. It might be also progress, relative to previous evaluations that a student's had. We also, any good neuropsychological evaluation includes that psychological component. And so we should also be understanding if there's any emotional challenges that might be interfering with the student's success, right? And then the goal, if we do a wonderful, thorough evaluation, if that doesn't lead us to a better understanding of what the interventions should be, then we haven't done something that's really of benefit, right? So there's a couple of points I want to make about this profile of, or this sort of pattern of neuropsychological assessment in its sort of modern form. The first is that it's comprehensive, right? And so we're looking at key domains, which you can kind of see on the left side. As I mentioned before, it's not just about seeing those strengths and weaknesses, but coming up with a conceptualization, an understanding of how those fit together to create what parents or teachers are seeing, and then to use that to guide our recommendations, okay? One of the things that can be kind of a misconception when folks are thinking about this kind of area of assessment is that, we sort of give this broad battery of tests. It's sort of a one-shot deal, and then we come up with that conceptualization from it. And one of the things I really want to emphasize for folks to understand is that neuropsychological assessment is really more like a fact-finding mission. So you start out very broadly in evaluating a student's strengths, challenges, all areas, right? And then as we see areas of difficulty, we follow up and dig deeper upon those. So when we say something, for example, like a student has delays in expressive language, that's usually not because of a single, or should not be because of a single test score being low. That's something that the evaluator has seen as a weakness and may be given 2 to 3 additional measures, right, to assess that. And that can be cognitive measures that look at things, but it can also be measures that might look, for example, at how an individual is functioning in day-to-day life. And so in some ways, we might think of a neuropsychological evaluation as being something that like an investigator of a crime might do, to go in and look at all of the facts, pull them together to understand what's happening, right? And so in that way, when we look at all of these tests, one of the things we're going to talk about is that Tests don't diagnose, it's an evaluator that does, right? That people do. And so when we kind of go over these areas of domains today, it'll be important for us to understand that there's not a single test for something like dyslexia. There's not a single test for attention problems because tests are complex and they measure a range of things. The proof and what we're looking for is patterns that emerge across domains, okay? So I also want to say at the outset today, I know it's very unusual to be giving them this kind of format where we're not seeing folks and getting feedback, but I want to let you know too that we are not doing questions as part of today's presentation just because of the time constraints. But if you do have questions, at the end, we're going to give you an email address that you can send any follow-up questions. I'm happy to take a look at those and follow up with any specific questions that you might have. And also, we'll certainly provide this information online too. So. All right, so let me just kind of do a quick primer just to talk about the basics of neuropsychological evaluation. The first is that tests that we use as part of these evaluations are both standardized and normed. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we are using tests that are administered the same way each time. So in other words, they have specific instructions or ways in which these different tasks proceed, and that should be the same for any student that's being evaluated. In other words, we don't want to be giving additional prompts or things that might give one student an advantage over others or give them a disadvantage relative to others. So we're using standardized ways of measuring things. That's very different, just so you know, than what we might be assessing on the ground in a classroom where we're observing how a student might do. Oftentimes there's levels of support being provided. What we're often looking at in these kinds of tests are what a student is able to do without those types of supports. How are they generalizing the skills to a standardized setting where there isn't that kind of support? The instruments are normed too. So many times when we look at scores, we're kind of comparing them to this bell curve that maybe many of you have seen. And that shows sort of the distribution of where folks kind of fall in terms of a given skill. And by normative data, by comparing to groups of thousands of individuals that have been selected to be representative of oftentimes the US population, right? We're able to see where that individual might fall. And you'll notice here, so what I've put on the right is a lot of these standard scores. What we're going to talk about today is that anytime you're looking at a neuropsychological evaluation report, or really any kind of standardized evaluation report, what you want to pay attention to is the percentiles, because that's often going to tell you where an individual will fall relative to others in that age or grade level group, okay? The standard scores and the scaled scores and the T-scores, all of those have different average or means, and so it can get quite confusing. What we'll often find too is that the percentiles are actually even more informative than these descriptors. The descriptors, some folks have a little bit of variability in how they use those or where they apply those different labels. But again, we're not wanting to get too hung up on individual scores, but to understand the overall profile of what we're seeing. Okay. What we also really focus on in neuropsychological evaluations is not just looking from a testing standpoint, but the evaluation results from a cognitive or academic test should really line up with what we're seeing from other sources of information. So these might be grading scales that we're getting from parents or teachers, a comprehensive clinical interview, right? So we're using all of these multiple ways of assessing and multiple methods to get greater reliability and what we're looking at. Things in some ways, I like to think of it as sort of many times, it's not always the case, but in most cases, we're sort of a click moment where things come together and you say, oh, this lines up with what we're seeing in day-to-day life. The testing is supporting that. And now we have a better understanding of what's going on. So the puzzle pieces do often kind of come together. And you oftentimes see it. One of the things that we do in our practice is participate in a lot of team meetings and after the fact of the evaluation. And I think that really bears out in those meetings when you sit down and talk about, a lot of times an evaluation like this is not contradictory with previous data that we have. It just expands our picture. And by doing that, a lot of times that can bring different teachers, providers, administrators, and parents onto the same page and understanding what we're seeing from a student. Okay. The last piece is that our recommendations are based on this objective data, right? And there's a bit of an art to that in terms of understanding, okay, what level of impairment do we need to see and how does that match up to what's a reasonable amount of intervention to be provided in a school setting? And again, that falls many times to the expertise and experience of the clinician to be able to know what the research says and match that up. But it is based on that objective data about what the profile we're seeing and what interventions we know work for that. So a typical assessment battery, and I would say, we don't always see this in every neuropsychological evaluation out there, but, at least in our practice, we feel that these are the core domains that an evaluation should look at. We should be looking at cognitive ability that are direct tests to look at things like language, attention, memory, visual motor skills, right? We should be looking comprehensively at academic skills, because that's going to tell us how this is bearing out in terms of how a student's succeeding. And we should be using parent and teacher questionnaires, or at least very comprehensive clinical interviews, to integrate all of that in. And in some cases where there's a need to understand how a student might be functioning in a school setting, things like an observation can also provide additional data. So we're really trying to take a very broad view to understand how students function, get that very big picture. What I'd like to do is, many times what happens is we look at neuropsychological reports and we might hear the language and it's quite clinical, right? And I really want to spend a moment just talking about the different domains that are assessed and sort of bring those back to the real world a little bit, so that when we talk about something like intelligence, we have an understanding, if you're reading a report down the road, of what that is. Right? What are we measuring? So we're just going to run through these key ones: intelligence, attention, executive functioning, learning and memory, language, spatial abilities, and motor skills, because those tend to be the ones that we often look at. Okay. So bear with me on this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pull back out and sort of think more broadly about, how evaluations can be useful and what we do with that data. So this is the original, so the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, or there's adult and child versions, and that's kind of considered to be largely the gold standard in terms of, and it's the most widely used test of intelligence. When we think about intellectual testing, this was David Wechsler who came up with the instrument. And of course it's very gendered language because it's the 1940s, but it says intelligence is the aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposely, think rationally, and deal effectively with his or her environment, right? But that's a lot of words. What I really believe when we are assessing intelligence, and if you sort of call all the data, what we're really looking at, so we're looking at an individual's ability to take new information that may be less familiar to them and draw connections, to think at a higher level, at a more logical level, about new information. And the reason we think that's important is it's just something that's quite important for day-to-day life. If I go and I try to start my car and it doesn't start, I've got to think critically about what might be happening. Is it out of battery? Did I leave the lights on last night? What could be going on, and how do I problem solve that situation, right? Do I have enough time to call a mechanic, or do I need to figure out how to get to work, right? So those kinds of higher level problem solving becomes really important in day-to-day life. And of course, it's also important in our careers and in academics, being able to draw those connections. What a lot of folks don't realize is that when we're measuring intelligence, we think about this sort of overall IQ score, which can be relevant for some folks. But for many students that have learning differences, when we're measuring intelligence, we have to think about how their learning profile bears out, all right? So let me give you an example here. Even on these more fundamental tests of intelligence, we might measure it with up to 10 tests. And we might have things that fall into what we call a verbal domain, or verbal intellect, and nonverbal intellect. And I've just given you two examples here. So the first one, verbal intellect, remember, I'm trying to make you draw connections that maybe you haven't drawn, or to think critically. And so I might say, in what way are a window and a telescope alike, right? Or I might say, how are a shadow and a fingerprint alike? I'm asking you to draw connections, but I'm also using language here. So if you're a student that struggles with language, I have to be aware that I might not be fully assessing your intellect. I might actually be, there might be some barriers there associated with language challenges, and we need to be mindful of that. By the same token, we could also measure those higher level abilities in a nonverbal domain. Okay, so you can see here, this is what we call sort of a matrix test, and it shows a pattern, across, the pattern will work across and down, right? And we have to sort of figure out what might go in that, square, the box that's empty. And a lot of times these will be multiple choice, but we're asking an individual to do a very different kind of higher level problem solving, still quite abstract, still higher level thinking, but it's more in that nonverbal domain. Okay, so we can already see that for a student that may have, for example, language-based learning disabilities, when we're measuring those verbally based domains, we may not be getting fully at their underlying intelligence if there are barriers to assessing that. And when we measure intelligence, we're really wanting to look at those higher level thinking skills. So we got to make sure that's what we're accessing for an individual. So just to show you an example here, this is from the WISC-4, so it's a little bit dated. This is the last version and not the 5, but for simplicity's sake, I just want to kind of show you that verbal and nonverbal. And so what we see is these are examples of two 12-year-old boys, right? Jeffrey and Frank, right? Both given the WISC, and you can see already each of these sort of 4 domains and final score is actually made up of even more tests, right? But if we look on the left and we look at Jeffrey, we can see that in Jeffrey's case, percentiles kind of tell us a lot of those domains are quite similar. 25 to 75 on the percentiles, 25th to 75th is average. So we're really seeing pretty average performance across domains. And so in Jeffrey's case, that full scale IQ is a good estimate of that underlying intelligence. But if we look at Frank, it's a very different picture. We see that Frank has a above average 79th percentile perceptual reasoning. Those are those kinds of nonverbal type of tasks. But if we look in the verbal domain, down in the 23rd percentile. So we're seeing a split there between verbal and nonverbal. And so the WISC is not, in this case, giving us a full scale or a summary estimate that's really an accurate picture of all of these domains. In this case, we may want to either utilize this measure of nonverbal intellect, or even give something called the test of nonverbal intelligence or something like that, that actually looks at the intelligence in a way that is not clouded by language, because what we're seeing is that the language is impacting Frank's ability to show those true underlying reasoning abilities. And what do we know? Well, if you look, it's not surprising to also see that working memory, many of which those tests are just holding verbal information in mind, happen to also be low. So even from this WISC, we're already getting a little bit of information about Frank's profile that might help us as we problem solve and hypothesize about the next types of tests that we want to use. So one of the things that we often look at very early on is attention. And the reason is if a student is struggling with attention, right, and they're struggling significantly with it in the test setting, right, that's going to impact performance. So we might be measuring vocabulary, but if a student is making impulsive or careless errors when they're pointing to pictures that match a word, we might not be measuring that as accurately as we'd like. So it's really important that we assess attention and get a degree to which and the extent to which it might be impacting performance, right? So I want to take a little sidestep as we're talking about this domain, because I think one of the things I very commonly see in our practice is parents sort of come in with a bit of a misconception about attention. Okay, so I'll have a very kind of classic case of a parent coming in saying, well, I know my child can't have attention deficits because they can play Pokemon cards for hours, right? Or when they're on that video game, nothing else exists. So I know it's not that they can't focus, right? And so oftentimes we're needing to do a little bit of critical thought about what attention deficits are. And part of it is that when we say attention deficit, it makes us think, oh, there's this deficit in attention. So I like to kind of back up and give a little bit of an analogy around attention so that we're thinking with clarity about what troubles with attention really look like. All right. And that's the flashlight. So if we think about attention as a flashlight, right? It's like we can't process everything around us at all times, right? There's limits to what we can process. And so we have to direct our focus like a flashlight, right? And so we may just say, let's, focus on this and not look out the window, or think about this and not what we're having for dinner later, right? So we have to kind of prioritize. And what that involves is self-control over our attention. All right. And so in many ways, folks that might have attention deficits, it's not that the flashlight is dull, that there's not a bright flashlight. And in fact, if there's something that someone's interested in, that's not really requiring control over the flashlight. So where are we going to see folks that have attention deficits struggle? They're going to struggle with being able to keep the flashlight on something that's not so interesting. They're going to struggle with being able to move the flashlight, right, back and forth. So multitasking, I'm doing something, then I get a text, then I got to go back to what I was doing, right? That sort of flexibility in my focus. And they're going to struggle if there's something else distracting, pulling me away, right? Whether it's internally thoughts or something else outside the window that's just more interesting or shiny, right? So we also measure these things using tests. So I just listed a couple of examples. That first one there's a great one. It's a really boring task and tells us a lot. It's like about 12 or 13 minutes and a student has to sit and press space bar after every letter they say on the screen, unless it's an X, then they don't press it. Right? It's a pretty sophisticated test because it measures how quickly someone responds and it measures their accuracy in responding or not responding. And it looks at changes in that over time. And all that's normed. So we're looking how much more difficulty is this person having with regulating their attention? Is it falling away more than others? Do we see more fluctuation in it? But it's also just behaviorally a great task. I'm thinking about a student, in our practice a little while ago, maybe a couple of years ago, because it was quite memorable, where we sort of left them in the room. You're supposed to not be too involved in this and give reinforcement. And so it's just kind of popped out of the room for a minute and looked back in. And he actually had his shoe off and the sock off and was pressing the space bar on the ground, pressing the space bar with his toe. And so that's kind of, some ways where we see might be some struggles with attention. Those multiple ways of measuring become really important and observations included. So let's talk a little bit about executive functions. And it's nice that we've started with attention and talked about the attention deficits as being struggles with self-control, because it's going to give us a way of thinking about executive functions. You've probably heard this term before, maybe many of you. It's the kinds of things that a secretary does for an executive, right? So organizing, prioritizing, time management, keeping track of getting things done, right? So making things go smoothly in the workflow. Right? But they're really actually higher level self-control skills. They happen in the same part of the brain as attention, in the front part of the brain. And the job of that part of the brain is to kind of exercise control over the whole processes. Attention is sort of a pretty basic control, but executive functions are more complex ways of controlling. So like if, for example, I were to go on a trip, right? And I needed to pack a bag. The dysexecutive or uncontrolled way to go do that is to walk around the room and grab things, right? And put them in the bag. But I'm gonna get there and have 3 pair of underwear for 9 days, right? So that's not a very effective, well-planned way of doing it. I need to take control over how I do the process. That might be saying, okay, I'm there for 9 days, I need 9 pairs of socks. Or it might be saying, okay, let's go day by day. Day one, I'm going to have, business meeting, and then I, want some clothes for dinner, right? Something like that. But either way, I'm exercising control over the process. So one of a better way to think about these sort of executive functioning skills to me is to think of them as sort of driver skills. Because that's what the driver does of a car. It exercises good control over the car. It's more than just the engine of the car. The driver has a role in making that trip go well. And so these executive processes, we use the car analogy and think about them. They're things like using the gas and the brake, getting started when you need to on something. Using a brake, maybe not just reacting, right? Or selecting a response, but taking your time, putting the brakes on, not being so impulsive, right? Being able to stop. These are all things that we see individuals with executive functioning can struggle with. We also might need to be in the right gear. A lot of times young people with executive dysfunction, sometimes they'll be doing something that they should be doing slowly, like checking their math homework before they turn it in. They'll do it in 5th gear, too fast. Whereas it's something like where they're needing to put dishes away, they might be down in 1st gear, right? And that's something you want to be doing quickly, right? So it's sometimes puzzling to families and parents that, why are we seeing this kind of discrepancy? They do some things fast, some things slow. It's because that difficulty with being in the right gear and the controlling the process. There's also all of these higher level driving skills. So learning from mistakes. Well, I took the highway last time, so I might want to not do that because there was so much traffic. Thinking big picture, even taking out the map sometimes and saying, all right, let me think about this as a whole, right? And that brings in things like time management, right? So if I need to be there in 5 minutes, I shouldn't be leaving. If it takes 20 minutes to get there, I need to leave on time, right? So that's the kind of stuff that helps us when we sort of think for parents that, you might have a child that has a really good engine. They could have a Ferrari, really bright kid with great engine and great skills. But if the driver skills are loose, that really impacts an individual's effectiveness. And so that's where I think of executive functioning and those sort of control factors as being important. And we assess them in a lot of different ways when we do evaluations. One of the things that we might do, for example, here on the left is something called the trail making test. And so if you were here in front of me, I would say, give you this and I say, okay, first, I just want you to connect the numbers in order. And you go 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, just connect those dots in order, right? For simple connect the dots. Then we might add in an executive component called set shifting. So I want you to draw a line from, and you can do it on your screen, but draw a line from 1 to A to 2, 2 to B, B to 3, 3 to C, and so on to the end. So number, letter, in order until you get to the end. It's going to take everyone longer, but what we're interested in is, does adding that set shifting component make it exponentially stronger for a student or an evaluator? The second one here is something called the Ray complex figure test. You might have seen that if you've come across it in testing if you're a provider. This is where someone needs to copy this in and try to create it as close as possible. And this is one of those tests where we're looking at accuracy, but I'm actually looking at an individual's approach and how they do this. And it tells us something about how they process information. So do they do it in an organized way where they sort of see the big picture and then fill in the individual details? Or they do it like this individual on the right, where they sort of start with the individual details and therefore there's not this organizing structure to how it's copied. Right. So these are examples of ways that we might assess executive functioning in a more direct way in the evaluation process. We would also be giving questionnaires and talking to families and teachers to understand if a student is struggling with those in day-to-day life. Right. So I want to talk a little bit about in the next domain, which is language and language related functions. Okay. And what I want to say about this, and this is going to be this case for our academic testing too, is that within especially a domain like language, there are multiple levels that if we're doing a thorough assessment that we want to look at, right? So we might look at the basics, the building blocks of language, which are phonics, so the sounds that we use to make words, and we'll come back to those. We might also look at the vocabulary, our knowledge of words, but then we may want to look in a more detailed way at how it's not just the words we know, but to be able to communicate effectively, we have to use grammar and syntax and structure to put those things together in a way that communicates our ideas and our thoughts. Right. And so there can be difficulties at all of those levels. And the last one's pragmatics. It's how we use language in social situations. So we might have someone that has all of those foundations, but if they struggle with being able to use language effectively to communicate about emotions or to communicate in a reciprocal way with others, we can see struggles with pragmatics. So a thorough assessment would look at all these. What I'll tell you is that we tend to screen these areas as part of a neuropsychological evaluation. And if we see weaknesses, particularly in those higher level skills like sentence structure or grammar, syntax, those higher level narrative or oral discourse kind of communication. Oftentimes we're referring to folks that have even more specialty in that area, more knowledge, and that might be a speech language evaluator, right? The speech language pathologist, to look in greater detail at those areas. Because if we see difficulties, we want to have a strong understanding of what they are so we can guide treatment. So here's an example of some of the basics ones. You could talk about, there's sort of a divide between receptive and expressive language. Receptive might be if I say, show me the one that shows spill. I'm just testing your comprehension of words. Expressive might be one where I say, I want you to name the word that goes with each picture. So, sun or storm or pour, things like that. And, many times we'll see folks that receptively are fine, but they may struggle with areas of expressive language. So they might be able to comprehend, but they might have difficulty with retrieving a given word at a given time or formulating language in a way that they're able to express themselves. So we can see the difficulties at all levels. So I also just want to touch on, since we're talking about these domains, I always take every opportunity I can to really reinforce what dyslexia is, because there are so many myths out there, and we think about letter reversals and that makes people think that it's a visual problem. And you'll certainly hear people talk about reading issues as complex and being multifaceted, but I think it's really important that folks have a good understanding that in the vast majority of cases, and in the cases that we refer to as dyslexia, there's a core area of difficulty. All right. And that difficulty is in what we call phonological awareness. All right. So to think about what phonological awareness is, we have to sort of think back to, early folks when they were really inventing written language, which, oral language precedes written language by thousands and thousands of years, right? So we were already using as people verbal ways of communicating, and maybe we were drawing things on the cave wall, right? Like a snake or a woolly mammoth or things like that, but there's limits to that. How do I show something like hope or happy? right? Happiness, right? These sort of concepts are difficult to show with illustrations. And so we had those words. And what we did was a pretty remarkable thing is we said, well, we're already saying happy. You know, obviously I'm simplifying, but we're already saying happy. Let's figure out a way to get that down. So we created letters that represent the sounds that we were already making. And for the vast majority of folks, that comes pretty intuitively, so much so that most of you will look at this word that's not a real word on the screen, and you'll say clat, right? But you're doing a pretty remarkable thing. You're seeing a bunch of squiggly lines on the page, and your brain, the language centers of the brain, is translating that right into the sounds that they represent and blending them together. It's a pretty remarkable thing, right? And I might also, for example, we do that when we spell. So if I say a word like glatch and you have to write it, right? I do this with families all the time, have them write it out. And, you know, so you think it's a one syllable word, but you're actually breaking that into a number of sounds, g, l, ach, right? And you're able to break that down and then make it into symbols, right? That's a language-based process that folks are doing, right? So much so that when we actually test for dyslexia, many times we're not even having folks, we have them read, but then we dig in more and use language-based ways of assessing. So to give you an example here, these are examples of tests when we talk about testing phonological awareness with measures like the CTOP, which are good, strong measures that look at things. We're actually asking someone to process the sounds in words. So tell me a word that rhymes with battle. Say pixel, and now say it again, but don't say pickle, right? What's the third sound in the word strip? Str. So folks that have dyslexia have deficits in that ability to process those sounds. And that is what creates difficulty with reading words that are less familiar. They just haven't visually memorized, right? Learning to read, because we're doing a lot of sounding out when we learn to read, right? And spelling, right? So those are the struggles. And even if folks are able to work around those and do it at the single word level, they might be working so hard to do that that it impacts other areas of reading, right? So I also want to talk about something that you may have heard called double deficit dyslexia, right? And that's really sort of like another sort of an additional challenge that can go alongside those phonics-based issues. And what it is, it's also language-based, and it's the ability to quickly attach a verbal label to something that you see. So we might even look at the beginning, the middle here, where it's animals. So it's going to be, right, cheetah, I think that's what that is, cheetah, cow, rhinoceros, fish, spider, you know, lamb, sheep. So being able to do that quickly calls on language centers of the brain. And we actually need to do that. If I saw the CH, I need to go ch very quickly, or I need to be able to even see a word and recognize it and do that. So that's my automaticity in being able to translate those letters into sounds or the words into their meanings. And the reason I put math symbols on there is that if somebody has struggles like this with dyslexia, that's also going to impact things like how quickly and automatically they can recognize other kinds of symbols like those in math, right? So that's why we see students with dyslexia struggle in these multiple domains. We're not going to walk through so also, and I'll just touch on it really quickly because I don't want to spend too much time, but there are other language-based challenges because dyslexia happens in that language center of the brain. When we do a thorough neuropsychological evaluation, we're not just looking and we see that there's dyslexia or suspect there's dyslexia. We don't just look at phonics, but we also look at these other challenges that tend to co-occur. And one is something that we call working memory. So that's being able to hold information in mind. The way we test it might be saying something like 2, 7, 5, and I want you to say that in reverse back to me, you know, so 5, 7, 2, right? And then we go up, make it more complex from there. But in day-to-day life, working memory is something like if I tell you to open up your math book, turn to page 37, work all of the odd problems, and then do 2 of the 4 bonus. You know, right? So everybody has a limited amount that they can hold. And for folks that have issues with working memory, that might be less. That cup that they can hold things in, it might be smaller. Right? Rote memorization can be a struggle for folks with dyslexia. Committing those rote words and facts and verbal information to memory can be tough versus a story. So I might see a student that if I tell them a story, they remember all of the details, but if it's just a grocery list, that's much tougher for them, right? Retrieving verbal information on the spot. So quickly being able to get that information out of mind can be a challenge, right? And as I mentioned before, those visual symbols with their labels. So point being that many folks that have dyslexia struggle with other language-based challenges that it's important that we identify. them, right? If you have a dyslexic student and you're not giving them that additional wait time or providing the kinds of support that they need, just verbally communicating, that's going to look like not having the knowledge for them. We're going to be underestimating what they know and can do. So this is exactly what can be the case for folks with unidentified dyslexia, or where we're not fully appreciating its impact. So this is from Sally Shaywitz's probably original edition of her book in 1996, but it's a student looking at a volcano and saying tornado. If you were to ask this student, you know what this is, it's a volcano, don't you know what that is? And they must, oh, actually, yeah, lots of lava comes out of it. There was one, they may know everything about it, but there's that mixing up of the words, right, that can happen. We see it in other areas too. So in science, by the time we hit 3rd or 4th grade, students are often asked to process very phonetically complex terms and words, often that aren't even really repeated or supported visually. And so it can really pose challenges in subjects like science. Math, as I mentioned before, can be a struggle as well. What's important to know is that when we assess academic achievement and we're looking at the impact of whether it's dyslexia or attention-related issues or some other kind of learning disability, we want to be comprehensively assessing. So just to give you an example, we're not going to talk about all academic domains, but I want to just talk about examples of reading competency. So you see that we should be looking at multiple areas. We might be first looking at whether or not when someone just reads a list of words, right? What are their sight words? What is their fund of sight words they can just read? Like, we might then be asking them to do those fake words, the ones I showed you before, where they're having to sound out. That's going to give us information about how they apply phonics when they're reading a less familiar word, right? Because they can't, it's not a sight word. We also might be testing that phonological processing piece, right? And then we're going to be looking at higher level reading, what I call functional literacy, because this is where the rubber meets the road, right? Being able to read fluently when it's a passage, being able to read it in an effective amount of time, right? And being able to comprehend and retain information as you're reading. So we would be assessing all of those is going to give us a thorough picture of where a student's reading, right? So one of the other things that we want to do with academic assessment is, as I mentioned before, there's these other things we're looking at. And one of those is looking at not just sort of where they are, but is a student reading at their intellectual potential? As we talked about before, determining what that potential is can be complex at times. We're usually able to do it, right? And then we look to see in a given academic area, is a student at that potential level? Right? Or using instruments that are co-normed, like the WISC and the WIAT, are we seeing statistically significant differences that aren't seen in much of the population, right? Are we seeing this student underachieve statistically relative to where they should be, right? That's going to tell us something. We might also be able to look if the student is reading at grade level, right? Is the score typical when we look at grade-based norms? Is the score in that typical average range, right? And is the student making progress over time? So just want to talk a little bit about each of these, right? I'm going to skip this one just time-wise because I don't think it's too germane to what we're talking about. But I do want to spend a minute talking about grade equivalence because there's sort of a point of controversy. I've come across it a lot in school meetings, and I think it's really important that we understand when we see grade equivalence in neuropsych testing, what they mean. Right? What that means, for example, with word reading here for this student, Tanya, is that the raw score, the total number of words that Tanya read, is more typical of a student that would be at the 2nd grade, the 7th month of 2nd grade. So that's the average score, that average number for students that are at that level. And so that's important. It still gives us important information. What we can't say is that Tanya is reading at the 2nd grade level. And here's why, just to give you a little example. So if we look here, right, this might be our list, and we're going to simplify it and just pretend it's a really short test, but might look like this. Okay, so Tanya read 4 words, right? She's at the 7th month of 2nd grade. That might kind of make sense, right? Sort of 4. We could get the same score with this kind of pattern. Now, that's not really reading at the 2nd grade level, right? So what that doesn't tell us, it tells us that there were 4 words, right, that were read correctly, and that gave us that score. Doesn't really show us, though, whether or not this is at a 2nd grade level. Still gives us some information, but when you hear folks push back on those grade equivalents, that's kind of the reason why. There's other complexities there too, but that's a big one, Lastly, I just want to talk about when we're looking at scores and we're comparing over time, which is another important role of neuropsych assessment, what that kind of looks like, all right? So there's a range of scenarios that we can see. The first one here is what we might call effective progress. And what you can see, I want to point out that we're looking at progress over time. So those same aged peers, when we look at the norm for that age, they've improved as well. All this is happening as a moving target. So all students are improving, but what's happening here, we can see in Tanya's case that these percentiles have gone from the 5th to the 18th percentile. Those equivalent scores have even gone up. And what we've seen is that what's happening is Tanya is closing the gap. So this is remedial progress. The student is catching up to those same age peers. Sometimes we might do this follow-up assessment and we might see something like this. And you can see that, you know, at time 1, right, at the baseline, Tanya's at the 5th percentile, and then at time 2 at the 7th. And those are very similar numbers, just really chance differences. And so what that looks like in its entirety is that the gap is about the same. So it's not that Tanya is not making any progress, but what's happening is Tanya is not making meaningful remedial progress. The gap is not closing, right? So this comes up a lot of times when we see students that might be making some progress, but they're not closing the gap, so it's not remedial progress, right? The next thing we might see is falling further behind. And we'll see if we look at these number of words read, we can see that Tanya went from a 32 to a 35. So it's not like Tanya's not reading a few more words, but it's not really even enough to keep pace with peers. Peers have improved and Tanya's sort of stayed roughly the same. And so we see a widening gap, and that's going to be lack of progress or falling further behind. The last one that we might see is pretty rare. It's where Tanya might have lost skills. A lot of times I'll sort of see folks throw out regression, right? Many times we're not seeing regression unless it's a really severe case where a student is not progressing just to a large extent, they've lost skills, right? Or we see some kind of neurological concern that might be causing a regression. So it's a relatively rare situation where a student maybe has lost words that they could read previously. Obviously, when we see it, it's quite concerning. But when we have concerns about progress, more times than not, it's either the lack of progress, right, falling further behind, or no meaningful remediation, just to give you a sense of that piece that we might often see. I'm not going to spend a lot of our time today talking about social emotional functioning, but I just want to kind of like put a pin there so that you know that when we have a thorough neuropsychological evaluation, there should be other instruments that look at this, and not just you know, a clinical evaluation, but using rating scales to see how a child or adolescent is functioning in school settings, maybe giving them self-report scales if they're old enough and able to complete those. And even sometimes doing things to kind of get at it in other ways, having students complete sentence stems or things like that that are more open-ended. We spend a lot of time doing clinical interviews with students because I think understanding the context of a student's progress is really, really important, and the impact that might be having on them socially and emotionally. And it really should be the role of a neuropsychologist if there's anxiety or OCD or something like that. I really feel that we should be able to do that as neuropsychologists. In some ways, if at its best, neuropsychology should be a mental, sort of a primary care of mental and developmental health, right? So the last thing I want to do is sort of pull all this together. We've talked about the different domains. We talked about what makes up a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation, right? So what become the next steps for that, okay? So what we do is we produce a neuropsychological report. You'll see a wide range of sort of page length for these. I think about 14, 15 is ideal, right? It's something that's comprehensive, but is also readable, right? It should be in language that folks can read, so that the family can understand, that the school can understand, and yet at the same time is meaningful to a provider as well that may have an experience with assessment, right? And then the most important part is that feedback with family members and sometimes a team, right? And so in our practice, we do not sort of take that report and then sit down with a family and just page through that, because we see that as sort of counterproductive. You get lost in the numbers. What we're really trying to do with an evaluation like this is understand the big picture of what's happening at that 30,000 feet view. We want to draw upon the data that we have, but the goal of the evaluation is to really conceptualize what's happening so that we can have something for moving forward. right? And we can have a clear goal. That's where that school consultation can be helpful, because we many times will come in and sort of try to get everyone on the same page and understanding the strengths and weaknesses. And we use the data to do that, right? And then, as we said before, sometimes that's not a one-shot situation. We might come back, a year or two later to see how a student is progressing and whether or not those interventions have had the intended impact, right? So let's return to Jeremiah, and you'll recall that there were a lot of challenges that parents were noting, and observing what the mom was kind of frustrated with Jeremiah, and really kind of understanding what might have been going on for Jeremiah. So we actually use a visual approach to feedback in our evaluations. And if you are a provider, or if you're a teacher and you get one of these reports and it's sort of like, how do I piece this together? A lot of times this is something that I kind of recommend doing, is trying to kind of for yourself understand how things, and it doesn't always have to look like this, right? But to really kind of break apart what's going on and think about how those things relate. So if we take all the data we have for Jeremiah, there were a couple of key things that we found in that evaluation. One was that Jeremiah's nonverbal intellect, the underlying intelligence, was solid. Okay, so there's not an intellectual disability there, not delays that are accounting for challenges there. We also saw other strengths. Visual motor skills were good, single word vocabulary. Jeremiah was really creative, artistic kiddo, and really, once engaged and comfortable, very enthusiastic, even about learning, right? But we saw two key areas that were impacting the student. And I think if you think about someone juggling, I think about this with parents, if you think of someone juggling, you can really only throw 2 or 3 balls, right, in there. Too many and folks can't do it, right? And so thinking in those sort of chunks of how to understand what a student's struggling with are really important. And the first one that we identified there was attention and executive functioning. So there were troubles with attention and executive functioning skills. And one of the particular things that was there was what we call slow processing speed. So Jeremiah, whether it was processing information verbally or visually or whatever, we were seeing a slowness to Jeremiah's processing, and that was creating challenges with being able to keep up with the pace of even conversation or instruction or day-to-day activity. Okay, so that was a really important finding. The second piece is that we saw issues that were language-based learning difficulties. All right, so we saw some struggles with language, that especially higher level sort of language, that narrative language, comprehending and expressing at that higher level, and that was enough to warrant a communication disorder. And when we see one type of language-based challenge, we always want to dig in and look. And in the case of Jeremiah, we also saw additional deficits in phonics that were consistent with dyslexia. So what we see is those two challenges were resulting in Jeremiah's academic problems. And what we saw is that the scores were more typical of like a second grader, right? So really significant delays academically, and actually relative to some previous evaluations that Jeremiah had a lack of progress. And so what we were seeing is kind of like a declining functioning in school, of like disengagement. And we were understanding that within the context of the significant communication and learning challenges that were going on. What we were also seeing when we did that sort of thorough emotional evaluation is that those academic problems were also impacting Jeremiah's self-esteem and sense of success and effectiveness, right? And that those were sort of resulting in feelings of anxiety. And actually, Jeremiah was showing some signs of emerging depression. So it really underscored the need for increased support. But was also kind of developing some negative patterns of managing that frustration, like avoiding or getting defensive. And those were things that were really important for us to highlight. The reason this is helpful to do it like this is it then helps us to target the interventions to those areas that we see as difficulties, right? And draw upon the strengths. So there's areas we know we don't need to worry about that are assets and strengths for Jeremiah. But what we might recommend is we might say, well, we know, looking at this upper right here, the language and phonological processing, we need to have interventions that address these communication challenges because they've been a source of frustration. We need to have multisensory reading instruction to address the dyslexia so we can see progress in the phonics. And we need some support for these ADHD related issues. So that might be referral to a type of therapy to address that, to increase his awareness, right? It might be accommodations and support for motor restlessness in the classroom, or even extra time or opportunities for additional time for processing information and understanding of that. And in some cases, if a family so chose, we might look at medication treatment options, right? And taking those together, by addressing those, we expect to see improvement in the academics. We might also refer, looking at these patterns of avoidance and defensiveness, we might refer Jeremiah to a therapist to maybe work with someone in better understanding the learning challenges and really working on some of the negative patterns that tend to be exacerbating how he's feeling about himself, right? So talking back to those negative self-statements, finding ways of increasing his engagement and other things that where he did feel successful. So by looking at these different domains, it helps to guide our intervention plan, right? And so that also gets families and schools on board with, all right, this makes sense. This is what's happening. Now we have a goal, what we need to target for this, all right? So that was a pretty whirlwind walk through neuropsychological assessment, but hopefully you learned a little bit about the process. Not every student needs a neuropsychological evaluation. Many times school-based assessments of high quality providers that are able to identify these challenges can help to support that framework that we just drew here without the need for neuropsychological assessment. But this is the end goal of what we really want to have for a student. And in some cases where there's complexity that's not at that face value, that's where a neuropsychological evaluation can be helpful. All right. So we really appreciate you joining tonight's webinar. If you have questions down here at the bottom, it says info.ma@dyslexiaida.org. Feel free to reach out to us that way. And I know our board can certainly forward on any questions or follow-ups. Thanks so much for joining tonight, and everybody have a wonderful evening. We'll also be posting this online for folks to review as on our YouTube website if you'd like to review it or share it with others who weren't able to attend tonight. Thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.